started. Welcome to Open Democracy's weekly live discussion. We've been having these panels every week throughout the pandemic, and this is the second one of 2021, and I think it's going to be super interesting. I'm Nandini Archer. I work as the Global Commissioning Editor at Open Democracy, specifically on the feminist investigative journalism team called Tracking the Backlash, and I'll be your chair today. So I'm very excited to introduce this week's panel. I think we've all been through a lot this year. I think we can all agree, or last year. And so there've been so many challenges, and I think we're all keen to stop listening to some of the same voices in 2021. So you're very lucky. We have some great guests for you. You'll get to hear from the wonderful Diane Abbott MP and former Shadow Home Secretary. We've got Sonia Adesara Doctor and reproductive rights activist. And we've got Choudhury Student and activist with the very exciting Cambridge rent strike campaign. And before we kick off, let me flag that these guests, and including myself actually, are all based and focused on in the UK context, but Open Democracy is global, it's a global media site. And so I hope we'll have a diverse audience from around the world, and please do feed in your comments, any comments you might have about this topic in your context as well. We do want this conversation to involve as many of you as possible. So big thanks to all of those who submitted your questions and your comments ahead of time. I've got them all here, and we're going to get through and address as many of them as we can. If you're joining us on Zoom, if you have questions or comments, please do click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and type into that chat window. And last piece of housekeeping before I move on to the exciting stuff, please excuse any noises and distractions, children and so on. Our homes or our offices at the moment, so that can sometimes cause problems. And my doorbell won't stop ringing because I've become like the post office for my neighbour. So do ignore that sound if it goes off. So without further ado, my first question goes to Tara, really. To start off with, Tara, you've been involved in some very exciting political movements recently. Could you tell us a bit about what sparked your journey into politics?
Hi, yeah, sure. So, I mean, I guess I was always kind of quite politically aware. Like I'm lucky enough that both my parents are state school teachers, so I kind of learn a bit about politics through that and through their experience. But I was never particularly involved in politics myself. I think just subconsciously, maybe I didn't really see myself in a lot of politicians. I didn't kind of see very many people that kind of looked like me growing up. So it's not really something I was ever super active in, but I was kind of aware of it in the background. And I mean, the short answer is I became involved in community organising through the kind of Labour Party's grassroots organising team By the Many. And I attended one of their events, and it was kind of like a open talk. Jeremy Corbyn was there, he was leader at the time, and it was about the environment and how we should kind of create a green industrial revolution that would suit the people of Blackpool. And it was kind of about policy making from the ground up, and I just found it really engaging, to be honest, and that was kind of the first time I kind of saw my interest in environmentalism and politics merging together. Yeah, so.
Great, thank you. And then Sonia, as a kind of campaigning doctor, you're straddling many different areas of focus, from migrant rights and reproductive rights and the conditions inside of hospitals right now. I mean, I know all of these things are connected. So what are the challenges you're dealing with right now? What's your focus?
Yeah, I guess I see politics play out every day in my job. So the challenges right now are just our hospitals are in a very difficult situation. So I guess every day I'm dealing with government incompetence, and I see, and actually I think we focus a lot about the hospitals during this pandemic, but actually for quite a few years now it's been a very difficult situation in our hospitals, and I've seen that the care that people get in the hospitals isn't good enough, and that's been a result of government policy. So I think, I'm trying to, people always ask me, like, why did you get involved in politics? And there's sort of different moments I can think about, but I do remember sort of quite early on in my career when I worked in a mental health hospital. And I just remember being so, I guess, upset at how awful actually some of the care that I saw was being given. And it wasn't because the staff weren't caring, but it was simply that there just wasn't enough staff. And as a result, I saw people actually that I could relate to, there were quite a lot of young people in the hospital being really let down. And actually, I felt were being left in a worse position from coming into the hospital. And then, another sort of real politicizing moment for me was when I worked in I volunteered in a clinic in London where people would come to who couldn't access healthcare. So it's sort of mainly migrants, but also homeless people. And that I just found, some of the things that I saw there and some of the people that I met, it was just, utterly horrific. And I saw people who, literally looked like my grandma, people that we could really relate to, and people for no fault of their own had ended up in this country without status, and then as a result were being denied sort of basic human rights, access to housing, were being denied healthcare, and that was sort of really politicizing for me, because I could see just the direct result of government policy and politics on people's experiences in a really horrific way. And yeah, so I think, and then also I think we've actually really seen this in COVID, but where I work, so I work now in North London in quite a deprived, deprived area of North London, and you do see that actually so much the things, people's social circumstances, people's housing, people's job security impacts their health, and I guess I felt like actually clinicians, we don't talk about that enough, but we see it, and we see that actually people were not able to live healthy and fulfilling and happy lives due to things that were out of their control and due to these structural inequalities, which again, I see people in power who are in the positions to change, and we're not tackling these things.
Great, thank you so much. And then Diane as well, how do you feel the circumstances for women of colour in politics has changed since you got involved? What impact, whether good or bad, has that had on the space for women of colour to organise and make their voices heard?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say that I didn't consciously go into politics initially. I got involved in social justice campaigning at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. You'd had the riots in Brixton, in Bristol, in Liverpool. I was involved in the women's movement as a Black woman. I only got involved in party politics later on, because as an activist, as somebody campaigning on police abuse of power, stop and search and so on, when I went to lobby MPs, I was surprised to find that even the MPs that represented very diverse areas, they were all white men. And it came to me that that I had to be the change I wanted to see. And that we needed a parliament which really reflected the community. And if no one else is going to run, myself and a few others thought we would run. I suppose the space for Black women now is better than it was 30 odd years ago when I first got elected, not least because when I first got elected, I was the only Black woman in a parliament of 650 odd. And that was the case for another 10 years. And then for a further 10 years, there were only two of us, myself, Dawn Butler, and before that, Una King. So there are a few more of us. I mean, now we've got a number of Black women in Parliament, but so it's better in some ways, but crueler in other ways. When I first became Member of Parliament in 1987, you didn't get the barrage of personal abuse online that you get now. And the thing about online is the abuse is like in your home, in your office, on your computer. So there are a few more women of colour in party politics, but it's a very harsh environment.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. I must say, actually, it's interesting that you mentioned yeah, that abuse, of course, I mean, I always knew it was abhorrent, but I think I was particularly shocked even finding that Millie being tagged on Twitter with you for this event. I was suddenly witness to like some of this stuff. So it's yeah, it's that is definitely something new and different, and it has been quite an eventful year. And I wonder, I mean, you were all involved in the 2019 election, and then since then there's been the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement. I was wondering if, Sonia, this question goes to you first. What sustains you in this time? Where do you find solidarity?
Difficult question. God, 2019 election just feels so long ago. I guess what sustains me, I think, well, number one, the things that we were calling for in that 2019 election, which at the time was seen as like, you know, radical and utopian and crazy, actually, you know, this pandemic has shown us were correct, you know, so funding our health service, having a proper care system, you know, things like broadband, you know, essential things, you know, we've been shown, you know, having proper funded public services, you know, all these things that we were calling for in the election were correct. So yes, you know, I realized we lost, but I think, you know, we should take from that actually we were saying the right things, we had the right ideas. We just need to get much better at, you know, how we communicate that narrative to a wider public. What sustains me, I guess for me, it's because, you know, I see the issues that I campaign on are real for me because I see them every day in my job. You know, it never really occurs to me to stop campaigning because I keep seeing the issues and actually it keeps getting worse. And I think, you know, I guess I always, you know, my my guiding principle is that, you know, if things can get better, and you know, things do change, but I don't think progress is inevitable, and I do think that you have to fight for it. And I think so I think, to be honest, I don't think there's an option not to keep going. And I guess just on a practical level, it's just some amazing people around me. Like, all the campaigning that I do is always with other people, and I guess I choose to be around people with the same values, same principles, and we sort of understand each other, work well together. I guess if you're in the left, there are some campaigns and some groups can become toxic. I tend to move away from that because I just don't have the energy for things like that. And then, yeah, just probably my mum. I call her up every now and then whenever I'm feeling miserable, and she just you know, gives me a kick up the arse. So just having also real people around you who can talk straight to you and tell you not, you know, my mum will be like, don't take yourself so seriously. I'm like, okay. So yeah, just having some real people around you as well to sort of keep you grounded is also really important.
Great, thank you. I wonder if anyone else has any thoughts on that question, any response to that question as well.
Well, I would say one of the things that keeps me going is other Black women. Throughout all my life as an activist and then as Member of Parliament, it's been the support and solidarity of other women of colour that has helped me to keep going. But also, it's what you believe in. If all I wanted to do was to wear a nice suit and go on Newsnight, I wouldn't have stayed in party politics as long as I have done. It's the things I believe in. It's about social justice. So knowing what I believe in keeps me going.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. I think politics felt like such a bleak time in 2019, especially because I was still quite new to everything, and I was so hopeful, and I'd become so passionate and involved in such a short amount of time that, you know, when we lost, it kind of felt like the end of the world. But I think what's really important to remember is those people that I met through campaigning and through community organising, they all still exist. I met so many incredible people, and what Diane said just then about women of colour is extremely true, and that's something that I was privileged to experience, to meet so many incredible women of colour that inspired me. Sasha, Josette, she was such an inspiration to me, in a way of, she was the person that kind of made me realise that there is a place for me, and that policy making is important for people, because when we're women of colour especially, but also working class people, when we're affected the most by these policies that are made in Parliament, you know, there has to be a place for us that in making those policies, because we are the people who are affected most by them. And I think that kind of sense of being inspired by the people that I meet on a day-to-day basis in policy making and in organising on a community level is really what keeps me going. It is the people that drive it, not the party politics, not necessarily being a member of a certain party, but that shared passion and that drive to try and make the world a better place. And with everything that's gone on with COVID, as depressing as it all is, that's kind of needed now more than ever, when we figure out how we want to rebuild and change things. And I think the one good thing that's come out of this pandemic is people realizing the world doesn't necessarily have to be what we've got used to. And we've got so used to just austerity and just depression and just a lot of sadness. And I think it's scary when people get accustomed to be treated a certain way. And we've got an opportunity now to rebuild, and that is exciting.
Great, thank you. That's like much more hopeful. I like that. Looking at some of the questions from the audience, from questions that they submitted before this panel, one of them kind of relates to what we've been talking about just now. They asked, do you think that the future of women of colour organising and having impact is in the traditional political structures, so political parties, the Labour Party, the unions, or do you think it lies somewhere else? I'll go to Tara first.
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. To be entirely honest, I actually did kind of rescind my Labour Party membership relatively recently, because I didn't feel as if there was that emphasis on prioritising women of colour in the party and by the party leadership. So I think there should be, and I think we have to focus on the efforts that are being made by women of colour and members of the Labour Party to ensure that our voices are heard. But I do think that the party and party politics shouldn't take our voices for granted. You know, so much incredible work is being done on the ground, and to speak to individuals and to kind of put you know, historically marginalized voices at the center of policy making. But that can only really be impactful to a party if a party chooses to listen. And I think we're in danger of taking voters for granted, and it gets to a point where people leave the party, and there's a real danger of that continuing to happen if more of an emphasis isn't put on really meaningful solidarity. You know, you can say Black Lives Matter, but what is the party actually doing to show that, and to amplify voices, and to not speak over people? And you know, I'm not sure where the future of organising is. I think it can be the Labour Party, but I don't think it necessarily will be. And either way, as I said earlier, you know, these people exist either way, and people always find a way to organise, whether that is inside or outside of the party. Hopefully it's inside though.
Any other thoughts on that, Sonia and then Diane?
Yeah, I actually completely agree with what Tara said. But I think, so I guess the answer is both. I think sometimes that we overemphasize the power of politicians and actually appreciate the power that normal people have, and actually just forget about the Labour Party. If you just look at the Tory party, and the party in government right now in the UK, and if we look at the past year, all the correct decisions that they've made, all the U-turns that they've made, have been a result of public pressure. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the power that we have if we can organise in our communities, if we can make noise, if we can get the people around us to fight for the things that we're fighting for. Then, you know, end of the day, politicians want to be elected. Not people like Diane, but there's a lot of politicians who just, you know, all they want to do is stay in power, and they stay in power by people voting for them. So actually, that gives us a lot of power. You know, if we can, you know, speak to those in our community, organise in our community, get people believing and fighting for what we believe in, and then that gives us a lot of power to then create the change from the bottom up. So both is the answer to your question.
And Diane, do you think the future of women of colour organising is in the traditional political structures or outside of that?
I think we need people active both inside and outside. And I say this probably because I'm a Black woman, and so much of Black politics from when I was a very young woman was outside formal political structures, whether it's the Labour Party or trade unions. I can remember 30 odd years ago being involved in the Scrap Sus campaign, which is the campaign against stop and search, the Brixton Defence campaign, which is a campaign that sprung up after the Brixton riots in the early 80s. A campaign called the Organisation of Women of African and Asian Descent, which was a Black woman's feminist campaign. So as a Black woman and someone that's, I hope, rooted in my community, I've always had one foot in community-based organisation and another foot in the formal Labour Party and trade union structures. You need both. You need almost to bring a pincer movement to bear on people in power. And I would say this, one of our colleagues said that the Labour Party takes Black votes for granted. I imagine if you're new to the Labour Party, that must seem very shocking. But I've had to deal with the Labour Party which wants to take Black votes for granted for 30 years. And we just have to say they shouldn't do it. I've said to colleagues over and over again that there's a generation of Black minority ethnic people, people in their 60s and so on, who are loyal Labour Party voters. But younger Black minority ethnic people are saying to the Labour Party, particularly under the new leadership, what have you done for me lately? Definitely, I've spent 30 odd years trying to tell the Labour Party they can't take BAME voters for granted. So I entirely agree with that. Yeah.
And I think just to add on that, and I completely agree about, people feeling, communities feeling that the Labour Party has taken their vote for granted. But just to sort of touch on what Diane said, I think also we shouldn't, just seeing people like Diane in these institutions does make a difference, I think. And, I think as I can't even imagine how difficult and how uncomfortable it is to go into these places that feel so, unwelcoming and not meant for you. But actually, people like Tara do need to go into these places and into these institutions, because actually representation does matter and it does make a difference. And when you are, as like people like Diane, who are rooted in the communities, we see from their politics that actually it's not just representation for the sake of representation, but their politics is different because they understand the material needs of the communities that they represent in a way that, in a way that's quite unique to their lived experiences.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I think the thing is, when we talk about representation, I think a lot of people have the tendency to see it very one-dimensionally, and they see it as almost tokenistic to want to have women of colour in positions of power. But it's exactly what you just said about, you have one woman of colour in power and the influence that has on real lives and on real experiences and on policy making. It's not about having a brown woman in office. It's about what that means for the community and for people like me, who, to be honest, politics was such an unwelcome idea for me. It wasn't even really a place. It wasn't that tangible. And yeah.
Great, thank you. I'm just looking at some of the other questions that were submitted.
Can I just add to what the other panelists said and say, no, it's not just about having a brown woman in power. Otherwise, you just end up with Priti Patel as Home Secretary, and that doesn't represent an advance for anybody. So, yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Great. No, that was a great intervention. Thank you. I was looking at some of the other questions that were submitted. One of them was to Tara and specifically about your rent strike plans. For what are your big policy demands for 2021? Have they changed? Are they the same? Interested to hear more about that.
Yeah, so I guess I've not really spoken about the rent strike yet, which is kind of why I'm on here, so apologies for that. But I think, at Cambridge, I think we've done something really special with this rent strike, and what we've tried to do is we've tried to reclaim the narrative, because I think in the media that the rent strikes have been kind of very reported in a way that kind of plays into the language of marketized education. And we're trying to not make it about that. We're trying to make this about a lot more than like quality of learning, and about the fact that COVID's disrupted our classes, and about this whole idea that we're not getting our value for money's worth, because that kind of fundamentally ignores the fact that education shouldn't be a commodity that you pay for. Education is a universal human right. And it's a lot more about the fact that we're not getting our money's worth. It's an issue that predates COVID, you know, that COVID's been the spark for this movement across the country in terms of rent striking, but the underlying issue has gone on since the Tories decided that education is a commodity, and that and I think the fact that we've worked so closely with ACORN, which, you know, is a community renters union, is really important, because the issue is landlordism, and the issue is the fact that our universities act first and foremost as landlords and providers of education second. And that's seen in how they've responded to us at every single turn. They've acted as with their interests as landlords and as profit makers first. So I think my policy priorities, as a woman of colour in particular, that they would be mainly to do with, in relation to the rent strike anyway, it's about kind of shifting the narrative and again seeing that we can demand more from these universities. Cambridge rakes in profits of over 11 billion pounds. You know, I'm quite a poor student. A lot of people that come here are, and I think you're made to feel when you're in this space as a woman of colour. I'm sure Diane knows this as well, someone who went to Cambridge as a woman of colour at the time you did as well, but you're made to feel kind of lucky to be here and to get the opportunity. And don't get me wrong, I do feel extremely lucky to be at this institution, but it's also a very scary place to be, and to have such a big financial burden put on your shoulders as the university continues to profit from your rent is shocking, and something needs to be done about that. And there's a balance of power that needs to be redressed between landlords and renters. So that's where my policy priorities are at the moment.
Great, thank you. Kind of related to this, and it's like a really big question that came up like 2 or 3 times from the audience for this event, was how do we ensure that the government is held to account for pandemic failures? What do you think, Sonia?
Vote them out. I don't know, mass strike, held them account. I guess don't forget. I guess what I get really annoyed, I feel like people have really short-term memories, and I think just don't forget that they got us into this mess. So just, even if you just look at the health system itself, you know, it is this party that has been in power for the past 10 years that underfunded our health system. You know, if we look at, you know, why we're seeing disproportionate deaths amongst ethnic minorities and amongst people in deprived communities, again, this government is responsible. They are responsible for austerity. They're responsible for the widening levels of health inequality in this country. You know, they could do things in their power to protect people, but they haven't. You know, we still don't have, you know, proper sick pay for people on 0-hour contracts. You know, we still don't have, you know, right now, when we know that levels of virus are soaring, you know, in London, people are still being forced to go into work. You know, so simple things this government could have done to protect people that they haven't. And then, you know, my personal opinion is, from the start, there has been so many government failures. They've dragged their feet. They've been incompetent. They've also spent huge amounts of public money and to profiteer their friends. If you look at things like the PPI scandal, if you look at test and trace, if you look at just recently with the food, the school dinners, you know, huge, like billions of our money has been essentially been lining the pockets of corporations funding to the Tory party. So we need to be raising noise about this. I think it's scandalous, and we need to just, if the pandemic wasn't going on, we should be rioting. Like it's horrific what they've done, and you know, lives have been lost. And actually, yes, you know, in this pandemic, I think it's 100,000 now lives have been lost. But prior to this pandemic, you know, for many years, lives were cut short as a result of this government's policies. So we need to communicate this, and you know, we need to. I think Tara mentioned this earlier, but I think sometimes, you know. I noticed this among actually like some of my friends, that they can become a bit, not numb, but sometimes because there's just scandal after scandal and bad news after bad news, people stop listening. And I don't really know how to counter that, but we need to make sure that people sort of understand the gravity of what's happened over the past, the past few years, and understand actually that there's people who have not just, been in charge and allowed that to happen, but have profited from that as well. And that is scandalous, and we do need to do something about it. And, as you said, hold our politicians to account and vote them out. People like Tara in politics.
Yeah, great. I do. Yeah, it is that kind of thing that people have such short memories, it seems sometimes. Any other thoughts on this, Diane? How do we ensure the government is held to account for these pandemic failures?
Well, it's what you just heard. You have to register to vote, and then you have to vote against them. I know that sounds boring even, and I know the slogan, if voting changed anything, they'd abolished it. But in the end, voting can alter reality. And I just want to make a point about the international scene, because Donald Trump was, he doesn't want to accept it, but he was voted out of office in the United States. And one of the things that made a difference was the organising of Black women. Black women in America are the strongest and most reliable supporters of the Democratic Party. And again, I'm not saying the Democratic Party is perfect, but goodness knows they're a great deal better than Donald Trump. And there was a woman in Georgia in the deep American South called Stacey Abrams, and she led attempts to get people registered, to get them out to vote, and swung that state for the Democrats, both in the actual presidential election, and then they had by-elections, what they call runoff elections. She swung to the Democrats, and that was about the sometimes unglamorous work of going out there, convincing people they should vote, registering to vote, and getting their vote out. And if there was one thing I wanted to say, that when we look at what's happening in America, we shouldn't forget the contribution of Black women activists on the ground to change in America. Thank you.
Yeah, brilliant.
And just to add, I think just to add on that, actually, I think US is really interesting if you're looking at their politics. Because if you look at the squad, so I'm a bit obsessed with Ilhan Omar, but actually, like, all there's been quite a handful, even more have come in the most recent elections, of women of color who have, as I understand it, like the US political system is a bit different to ours in that they'll have primaries just to be the candidate for that party, in the way that we don't have here. But so you have these women that came in through grassroots organizing, and you can see that actually with their politics, that they've come from through grassroots organizing, and they are putting forward really bold, radical ideas, like the Green New Deal, Medicare for all. It's funny how that's presented as a radical idea in the US, just healthcare for everyone, sort of basic human right. But it's these women that are coming through grassroots organizing who've actually shaken up the political system over there, who've said actually to the Democrats, to the left-wing party, that actually, yes, you say that you're standing for working people, but actually, your history and your politics has shown that you've actually not made much difference materially to working people, and they're being loud and they're being bold and they're making noise. So I think actually we can learn from that as well. That on the left, and that sort of, I'm talking about the political left. If the party doesn't really stand for working people and actually doesn't put forward policies that make a material difference to people's lives, then people won't vote for you. And then you have people like Trump come in, or what's his name? Farage. People that pretend, so-called working class people, who sort of speak the language, but actually again don't offer anything. But people then will vote for reactionaries because they've frankly get fed up when they feel that their lives haven't been made a difference by the people in charge.
Yeah, I think like we really have to look at, and the big lesson to be learned, as you were saying, is what can we take from the incredible grassroots organizing that's been happening in America. And I think a big lesson is how on the left do we create leaders. And I think that a big part of that has to be leaders within communities and empowering people to feel like they can take charge of their own destiny. And we don't necessarily always have to look towards politicians, obviously a big part of it is voting massively, but it's creating that sense of empowerment for people to feel like they can, you know, take charge of their own destiny and advocate for themselves almost. And I think that's something the Labour Party needs to be really hot on, is creating leaders across communities, and that sense of empowerment is something that has real material impact in communities that do feel so disenfranchised, and that disenfranchisement is something that plays into the Tories' hands and is a detriment to people's lives. And I think if we start focusing on that and that sense of political empowerment in a really kind of organic and material way, then I think we'll make a lot of difference and have a strong opposition. I just think it's shocking, to be honest, that you know, Marcus Rashford has to bring attention to issues, and things have to kind of explode on social media for change to happen. But it does show the pressure that the public can have if they're organised, and if, you know, people care about these issues. You know, I think a lot of the time it's easy to be negative when you're involved in organising and feel as if no one cares, but I think a lot of the recent uproar shows that people do care, but there has to be a space for people to organise, and there's a lot of passion, there's a lot of compassion in this country, and we just need to find the best ways to channel it, and I think that has to come through grassroots organising, and I hope that there remains a place for that in the Labour Party.
Yeah, and I think, you know, just to add on that, like, if we I think often we focus a lot on the leaders and I guess this, you know, the face of the campaigns. But if you look at the big things, so if you look at, you know, the Green New Deal, yes, AOC has been, you know, the face of it, but the Green New Deal came from the Sunrise Movement, and that was young people organising. If you think about Medicare for All, it was, you know, the nursing trade union, you know, National Nurses United, which is, you know, actually I went to their conference last year, and they are phenomenal. And actually they're led by women, but predominantly, you know, women of colour in US. So just, you know, nurses across US unionizing, organizing, and saying, hey, this is what we need for the health of our people. And again, like what Tara was saying, you know, we've seen it again in the pandemic, not just with Marcus Rashford, but if you remember over the summer when they what did they do? You know, the government did something about the exams, and then literally the school kids just got into the streets and, you know, were protesting. And then what was it, a day, and then the U-turn. So like there is power in organizing and sometimes just getting out on the streets. You can, you know, we've seen that it just, you know, just in the past year, the difference that can make.
Yeah, great, thank you. I mean, actually, that was one of the questions from the audience was, what lessons do you think we need to learn about how to ensure policy is made by the people most affected by it? I think we've totally touched on that. Another question that's come through is around solidarity, and this idea of solidarity, which can often seem so performative. And that the question is, how can we forge more meaningful, transformative alliances between women of colour and white women in a way that doesn't seem performative? I wonder what you'd say to that, Tara.
I think it's a really good point, because I think, you know, I come from a very, very white area. You know, I'm from Blackpool, and I think, you know, there's so many well-intentioned, amazing activists that want to help. And I attended actually a Black Lives Matter rally in Blackpool, which if you'd said that to me, I don't know, even just a year ago, I would have thought that was impossible. I really wouldn't have thought there would have been so many people that cared. And I mean, unsurprisingly, that the rally was a majority white people due to the demographics of where I live. But still, it kind of made me realize, like, that there are people that care. But I couldn't help but think, you know, we've turned up to a rally, and, you know, we've turned up to you know, shout Black Lives Matter, but how many of these people are gonna do something in their day-to-day lives? How are we going to kind of go beyond, you know, standing, you know, for photos and holding signs and pickets, and how are people going to kind kind of act on these feelings. I don't know, really. It's a tricky question. I mean, I think the main point for meaningful solidarity has to be not speaking on behalf of people when people can kind of speak for themselves. So a lot of that does come down to platforming. I think it comes back to what we were all saying earlier about the fact that it's not necessarily tokenistic to kind of platform women of colour, and events like this are so important, but and it's kind of just recognizing that it's a lot more, it's not tokenistic to have women of colour events, because people don't seem to mind when panels are full of old white men. That's just kind of seen as the norm. No one accuses that as being kind of tokenistic or shallow. It's about recognizing that our voices have been continued to be ignored in these spaces, and we have to carve out those spaces on our own. So I think in terms of meaningful solidarity, white people, white women can recognize that there are opportunities where, you know, they can step aside and allow Black women in particular to talk for themselves. And I think you can bring attention to an issue if you're passionate about it, and you can be anti-racist and white, but not every opportunity has to go to a white person to speak on behalf of us and our issues. There's ways in which you can bring attention without taking up space that could be used for women of colour to advocate for our own interests and opinions.
Great, thanks. Any other thoughts on that solidarity being performative point?
Yeah, I think so my sort of, you know, understanding of Black Lives Matter and what their calls for is that they were, you know, the calls are, it's calling for structural change and system change that, you know, and I think actually what I saw is a lot of people reacting to it thinking that it's about individual and behavioural change, you know, and it's saying, oh, I'm going to be a nicer person and we're going to do my bias training, and actually that's not what the movement was calling for. And I guess, you know, the second thing is, you know, I personally, like, I don't care too much about what song is sung at the proms or whatever, like all the, you know, who watches the proms, who was calling for that. And actually I think sometimes we've been sort of sucked into a narrative and conversation that actually you know, people weren't even asking for. But what I do care about is, you know, Black people and ethnic minorities in London dying at a younger age than more privileged people. I care about the fact that local hospital, I'm much more likely to see a Black or brown child being admitted, you know, with respiratory conditions. You know, the fact that I've seen children die from asthma attacks because the air quality is so bad in our area. And as an ethnic minority child, you're more likely to be living in areas with higher levels of air pollution than if you are more privileged. So I think actually, you know, I don't really care if you have, you know, BLM in your, you know, your Facebook profile or you've done your bias training. What I care about is, you know, is if you are supporting policies and supporting change to address these structural inequalities that are holding people back from communities. So again, that's a long answer to the question, but actually it's not really about, you know, you can do all the performative stuff, but actually it's about people care about material change in their lives, and that's what we want people to be fighting for.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Sonia. Were you going to say something, Tara?
Yeah. Oh no, go on, Diane, it's fine.
Well, just to say, and this is a small point and it is a bit performative, but years ago, if you went to a left event and the whole platform was white or the whole platform was male, people would complain and complain very noisily. But we seem to have gone backwards from that a little. And if we're talking about actual solidarity on issues of racial justice, first of all, it's important to have Black and brown people in positions of leadership rather than white people who've adopted the narrative of anti-racism, talking on our behalf. Second of all, we've got to support each other. I have seen so many Black struggles and campaigns undermined because we didn't support each other. So we have to stand up for the principles of racial justice, and we have to support each other. And actually, and I don't think anyone on this panel thinks this, it's not that we're asking white people to do us any favours by caring about racial justice. The left, the progressive left, will be so much stronger if it embraces the racial justice issues. I mean, look how much the Squad, AOC and so on have done for the left in America. They get particularly attacked by Fox News and Donald Trump and so on because they're particularly effective. They wouldn't attack them if they weren't frightened of them. So we need to stand up for each other, and we need to insist that we're not just there as kind of window dressing, but that we're put in positions of leadership where appropriate.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I think that's such a good point. And I think like something that's just been in my head then when we were all talking is this necessity for us to develop a language and to kind of rewrite the narrative and just the way we speak about race and issues, because I think the tendency so much is like what Sonia said is for the media in particular, you know, they're so guilty of this, is to fixate on very just kind of shallow issues that people aren't actually really bothered about and completely ignore the structural issues that really make the difference in people's lives. But in order for us to really kind of get to those issues, a lot of it's very complex, and I think we just need a better political education, and with that comes a better understanding of race. And I think until people are taught in schools about, you know, British history, about because people need the language to express these things, and until we've got the vocabulary necessary to understand these complex issues, I think a lot of well-intentioned people often miss the mark. And to be honest, you can't really blame people, because you know, these things are deliberately kept from us. You know, there's a reason why the government don't want us to know about the painful history of colonialism and how it continues to affect and impact society today. There's a reason why they don't want us to know that, and it's because of the power that we can get from understanding our history. I don't even think things like they would even attempt those things like the Windrush scandal if they knew that people had the kind of education and knowledge where everyone could advocate against that, and they rely on that ignorance. And it's something that we definitely need to challenge and go into our communities and work on, and because we can't continue to allow ourselves to be pitted against each other. I think, you know, Liz Truss said something recently kind of condemning identity politics and saying, oh, we're going to shift away from identity politics and race, and, you know, we're going to look at, you know, class, and it just seemed like such a ridiculous thing for someone to say. But it also really highlighted the fact that it plays into the Tories' favour if we allow identities to be kind of pitted against each other, and it just ignores the fundamental facts that there's no such thing as the kind of white working class traditional Labour vote, and then there's BME people. You know, these things intersect, and I think as soon as we kind of stand together and work together and not let these ridiculous divides get in the way of, you know, meaningful solidarity and meaningfully working together and trying to understand where we're all coming from, and that we all want the same thing here, I think we'll see a lot more success in our campaigning and in our activism.
Yeah, and
just a word on, so sorry, but just a word on identity politics. I just think it's absurd when people like Liz Truss and Kemi Badenoch go on about identity politics. Who are more identity orientated than the right in this country? It's about being white, or pretending you are if you're not actually white. It's about being white, it's about being male, and it's about being privileged. Few people are more engaged with identity politics than the right, but they want to put it on us. So we can't allow them to denigrate the struggle for racial justice by talking about wokeness. That's the thing now, and identity politics. What it is, it's a way of undermining a united struggle for racial justice.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Diane was about to say, the same thing. And you know, the right have been doing this forever. It's a way to divide the working class. And you know, I heard what she said, and what Ben Bradley's been saying this all year, and I get so angry at him whenever I see his Twitter. But this, you know, this idea that you know, a white boy from Blackpool is not getting into a good university because of the brown kid from Bethnal Green is rubbish, right? It's not the brown kid in Bethnal Green. Actually, it's the problem of Peter from Windsor, and I think we need to really get this, like, just this now. It's a ridiculous narrative, but actually I think it does seem to keeps taking hold on people. We need to be very, very clear that actually it's not because of race. These are class issues. These are class issues as to why there are certain barriers which people from all races that are not able to get into these positions, these more privileged positions. And it's not the fault of your brown neighbour, it's the fault of these systems of class privilege that actually people like Liz Truss and Ben Bradley want to keep in place. So yeah, yeah, I find it infuriating, this, yeah.
Like, I think what's so funny as well is the fact that the Conservatives are so keen to play into identity politics when it suits them. So you'll have them promoting Sajid Javid and Priti Patel as being kind of model minorities, and when we fit their agenda and when we act as puppets for the system that they want to uphold, and they're more than happy to play into identity politics. But the second we actually have voices of our own, that gets dismissed, and it's just that blatant hypocrisy that really bothers me, because they're not even consistent in their dismissal of identity politics. It's a tokenistic tool that they use when it suits them, but they're just as fast to criticize any meaningful work that we do as women of color on the left as being nothing more than identity politics. When we raise issues of race and of class, then it's such an easy term for them to just dismiss us with, but it just has no basis. I completely agree. It's just a ridiculous term.
We're going to have to wrap up in a minute, but interestingly, we did have a question from the audience specifically about this, Liz Truss and her comments specifically. So this one's to Diane. How do you think the Labour Party should be responding to this culture war approach, is the question.
Well, they shouldn't be giving into it. That's what I would say. And there's an idea around in the Labour movement that in order to get back what they call red wall voters, people in constituencies in the North and the Midlands that are post-industrial and always used to vote Labour and voted Tory in 2019, that in order to win those voters back, we have to move right on issues like policing and security, and what goes along with that idea that we have to move right on so-called law and order is the idea, you keep hearing people in the Labour Party, some of them who should know better, talking about working class, the working class. And actually it's a euphemism for the white working class. And the thing I try and do, amongst other things, I always try and stress to people when they start going about working class, that you can't talk about working class as if it's an exclusively white working class. You have to understand that black people and brown people are just as much part of that class as anybody else. So the Labour Party has to stand up to the Tories. It has to stand up to the notion that we have to move right on law and order and issues like that. And we have to stop talking about winning back working class voters as a kind of euphemism for winning back white voters, because actually that sort of politics is a brick wall for the Labour Party. And that's what I say over and over again. We have to reject this right-wing narrative about race and identity. It's blown up in the face of Americans with that riot by Trump supporters in Washington, and it will blow up in the Labour Party's face if it's not careful.
Yeah.
Any final points, Sonia?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And just what Diane said, like when they talk about the Labour heartlands, are they not saying that Hackney and Tottenham and Brixton and East London, are they not Labour heartlands? Is it just because they are brown areas that you're ignoring them from this Labour heartlands idea? And you will lose those votes. Don't take them for granted. The second thing that I'd like to say to Labour Party politicians is, if in your pursuit for power, you are prepared to sacrifice or sideline people who are most disadvantaged in our society, whether that is immigrants, whether that's ethnic minorities, whether that's trans people, then you are not on the left. And you have lost face of what I would say left-wing values. And then just continuing on Diane's point, is that we have seen in US that if you don't challenge that toxic narrative, you see where that leads to, and it leads to, you know, fascists marching on the street. And we will have that here if we don't challenge the narrative. And I think you have to, you know, we need to learn lessons of our very recent history. You can't just, if you don't challenge the narrative, it will continue to simmer. So the Labour Party does need to be a bit more bold in countering this stuff and creating a new narrative. And, you know, people like Diane are, you know, fiercely doing this and have been doing it for years. But I would urge the Labour Party to be a bit more bold in this and stop essentially, you know, cowering to this this toxic right-wing narrative that they just currently just allowing to flourish.
Thanks, Sonia. Any final points, Tara, and then we're going to have to wrap up.
Yeah, I think we've got this. I don't know if this is like a British thing or what, but I think we have this tendency to hope if we don't talk about things, then they'll just kind of go away. And a lot of people that would never say that they were racist or anything, they prickle at the idea of anything being framed as anti-racist or just talking about race. And, you know, even in response to this event, I saw people commenting saying, "Oh, is there any need to be so divisive about having a women-only panel, a woman of colour-only panel?" You know, that's quite a divisive thing to put together. You know, you're isolating me and you're disenfranchising me. And I just think that's the kind of narrative that we need to challenge, and we need to talk about race, and we need to talk about class in ways that in ways that kind of show people that just by talking about this issue, you know, we just need to kind of challenge the idea that talking about these things kind of comes at the detriment of anyone who doesn't fit into these categories. You know, well, when we talk about racial equality, it seems obvious to say, but, you know, that doesn't come at the detriment to white working class people. And I think Diane hit the nail on the head by talking about this euphemism. And it's something that I've experienced a lot in Blackpool, is just constantly, oh, how do we, you know, enfranchise the working class vote, rather than the kind of metropolitan London vote. And you know what they're trying to say when they say metropolitan London vote, and that's certainly not it. That they're on about black and brown voters. And as a woman of colour from the north, I'm sick and tired of kind of seeing these two parts of my identity pitted against each other, and it's not necessary, because the most meaningful solidarity intersects both race and class, and realizes that, you know, our enemy is the same enemy, and it's, you know, corporate capitalism, and it's the Tories, and it's all of these things.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry, but I have to end it there. I could listen to the three of you for hours and hours and days, but it's my job to finish this off now. So thank you so much to everyone for joining this debate, and to our audience. And for those of you who are new, now we're happy that we have you, so please sign up every week. We have a weekly debate, and you can find out about them on our website, opendemocracy.net /live discussions. I think my colleague will put it in the chat. We have a newsletter, and also Open Democracy relies on contributions and donations. So if you want to see more public interest journalism like this, please do consider supporting us. Thank you all again so much, and hopefully see you all next week. Bye.
Thank you.